title of my presentation is Qui suis-je? Raising questions around the Charlie Hebdo event. And one of the role of the social scientist is to think about structural issues in order to go beyond the event. So if the event happened, I need to understand what made structurally, what are some of the causes of that event. So I would like to think here about some of the structural issues by raising a set of questions. And by no means these are not the only questions that I would like to raise. There are more, but I'm constrained by the time. So may I start with the suggestive title of this presentation, to ask question, Qui suis-je? Suggests, at least for me, two important things. First, that beyond the simple and basic position that we can only side with the principle of freedom of speech and state emphatically, je suis Charlie, that there is another philosophical point that we need to think about, and that has to do with the extent and limit that have historically been imposed on our liberal values, regardless of where we are. What, if anything, has Charlie Hebdo has to do with philosophy? Although widely neglected in mainstream media and debates, this question calls attention from anyone interested in freedom of speech, respect of other people's religious beliefs, and mutual cultural understanding between people. My point here is that the philosophical question of the limits of freedom of speech and respect of other people's religious and cultural beliefs is essentially perennial, if only because this question will continue to generate perennial controversy between those who insist on the principle of religious tolerance and those who look at it from the perspective of freedom of speech. Although I do not adhere to such a dichotomous way of looking at the issue, in our societies, some realities, principles, and ethical positions might stubbornly resist clear-cut positions and analysis. I will come back to the question of freedom of speech later. But what we can engage in is at least clarifying some of the issues at hand, and think beyond the event of Charlie Hebdo to identify more structural problems. In this process, raising further questions about the controversy might be useful. Even though my friend and Dean Masari said we will not speak about religion, I do want to start with something about religion. While I do believe that Muslims should not feel at all on the defensive if such a violent attack by an individual or two is committed in the name of Islam, let me start with the question of what should really reaction of a Muslim to such an event or such a cartoon be. In order to answer this question, I think there is nothing better than the religious text itself. And I apologize if I read this in Arabic, but I can translate in general from the Quran, and I'm quoting only one aspect. There are so many quotes. قال الله تعالى ادعو إلى سبيل ربك بالحكمة والموعظة الحسنة وجاهدهم بالتي هي أحسن وجادلهم بالتي هي أحسن ادفع بالتي هي أحسن فإذا الذي بينك وبينه عداوة كأنه ولي حميم. There is nothing here about violence that one can speak about. In the hadith, we have إن الله رفيق يحب الرفق في الأمر كله. There is nothing here about going and killing people. So from typically religious discourse, one has to raise these kinds of questions from at least this religion. I'm often I hear about people in France or some people converting to Islam and joining ISIS or joining Al-Qaeda. I think they have converted to Al-Qaeda or ISIS. They have not converted to Islam. While we can only strongly condemn any violent act committed by any individual, I think we need to be careful about statistics, especially when considering the issue of representation of Muslims in Europe and the phenomena of surmédiatisation, otherwise blowing things out of proportion, and also stigmatization of Muslims in Europe. What do statistics tell us? Information by a report from the EU shows that from 2007 to 2009, out of 1,317 terrorist attacks, and these are reported by the EU, only 3 of them were committed by Muslims. From a percentage standpoint, that means only 0.2% of terrorist attacks in Europe were committed by Muslims in those years, far less than 1%. If we put the data from the years Europol started keeping tracks of terrorist attacks, including 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, and 2010, out of the total of 2,139 terrorist attacks, only 10 of them were committed by Muslims. In terms of percentage, this means 0.5% of terrorist attacks in Europe, and that's something that is very important. Now, in spite of these facts, what we generally hear about in the media and national discourse is the threat of Islamist terrorism. The data, however, does not support such fear-mongering. Yet it is amazing how many people will persist in the belief that Islamist terrorism is an existential threat to Europe and the US. We need to ask questions, again, raising questions, to what extent does bringing the terrorist threat detract us from real issues, whether in Europe and the United States? The irony, which reveals a real structural problem, because we are interested in structural problem, is the Europol report themselves. After doing the report, they end up with some interesting conclusions. After years, year after the report, the same data with terrorist attack by Muslim numbering, as I told you, only 1%. What do we end up with the conclusion? The report notes that, and I quote, Islamist terrorism is still perceived, and this is a quote from the report that speaks about the very minimal percentage of terrorism. Islamist terrorism is still perceived as the highest threat to most member states and concludes that the threat remains real and serious. This is basically, quote, the report, which is stating that very minimal percentage is still making this statement. So basically, this section still speaks about this. Statistics that are, and in which Islamic terrorism is heavily exaggerated. And this is something very important. As I told you, does this fixation on so-called Islamic terrorism detract us from other socio-economic and political issues that Europe is faced with? The second one question for me that I find interesting is the Charlie Hebdo controversy a new phenomena? Is it freedom of speech or provocation as well? We have the 2006 controversy over the cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad in the Danish newspaper, which was never resolved, and the issue has over-emerged. We have on September 2007 the Swedish cartoonist Lars Vilks, who had drawn a cartoon showing the Prophet Muhammad's head on a dog's body, which was published by Nerik's Allehanda newspaper on August 18. In October 2007, the far-right Danish People Party unveiled an election advertisement depicting a hand-drawn representation of the Prophet under the slogan, "Freedom of speech is Danish, censorship is not." The advertisement was condemned by many, of course, Muslim organizations. To what extent, may I ask, does the far right really advance the causes of liberal democracy? Another set of questions is, are similar issues raised in other contexts? Very much so, and this should raise our attention that this has nothing to do with some sort of cultural specificities of Muslims. Tracking the imagery of African Americans in New Yorker cartoon, Ruth Thibodeau described how, prior to the civil rights movement, cartoonists could probably portray blacks in openly stereotypical or derogatory fashion with relative impunity. This is in the 1940s and 1950s. But then Thibodeau finds clearly such depictions no longer appear in the New Yorker afterwards, as the civil rights movement established. This tells me also that there is a sense of there's no sense of fixity about what we perceive as, so there is always potential for change. The Commission for Racial Equality in the United Kingdom called for all bookshops to stop selling Tintin in the Congo in a 1930s graphic novel by the Belgian writer Her, describing it as follows. This book contains imagery and words of hideous racial prejudice, where the savage natives look like monkeys and talk like imbeciles, end of quote. There is concern about how we depict others. When Dave Brown of the newspaper The Independent drew a cartoon of Ariel Sharon eating a Palestinian baby in allusion to a well-known Goya painting to comment upon Israel's treatment of the Palestinians, many Jewish people believe the imagery in the cartoon had been lifted straightforward from the virulent anti-Semitic Nazi organ Die Stirner. They believe that the journalist Dave Brown was intentionally making reference to the medieval blood libel where Jews had been falsely accused of slitting the throat of Christian children in order to use their blood to butter their matzah. This resulted in a series of condemnation by Jews around the world. Cartoons have prompted similar controversies within Israel itself, and a journalist was forced to resign from his position as a result of what was perceived as blasphemous. Is it just about freedom of speech? What kind of structural issues can we be faced with? In Europe, anti-Muslim prejudice covers a broad spectrum, ranging from the childish, otherwise Italians politicians walking a pig on the building site of a mosque, to the hateful, the desecration of 148 Muslim graves in French military cemetery. As the general public is more likely to think the printing of a cartoon depicting the Prophet should be allowed under free speech, Gallup also analyzed public attitudes vis-à-vis various groups to ascertain that if Europeans exhibit some exceptionalism toward Muslims. Based on the statistics by Gallup, Europeans perceive Muslims more negatively than any other group. This is Gallup who is presenting this statistic. Additionally, the French and the Germans are more likely to hold negative rather than positive opinions of Muslims. However, Muslims living in the 3 European capitals express more positive than negative opinion of most groups. This is again Gallup that is making this statement. While the British public is slightly more likely to view Muslims positively rather than negatively, this group also elicits the highest level of negative opinion in the United Kingdom. So across the channel, Muslims stand out as a group that draws the most negative opinion. And I think we need to take these statistics very carefully. I would like to end by raising one final question. I would like to end by this presentation, even though it could be the set of next panel, by making similar questions about our own context and how we view Christians, Jews, and Muslims. I think we should also raise questions about our concern for Islam, where when Islamic State engage in violent actions against their own people, sometimes in the name of Islam. And we do need to raise these kinds of questions from within our society in order, again, to ask more broader questions. Thank you very much.